while I'm fiddling around. All right, so hello and welcome to the second installment of our series of Talking Heads interviews, where we delve into the work of the Wage and Employment Dynamics team. Today I'm here with Professor Alex Bryson from University College London. Alex is an applied labour economist with a background in sociology and employment relations. So welcome, Alex.
Hi, Naomi. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing? So just to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about you, your background and your research interests?
Yeah, well, I've been active researcher in labour economics for 30, 40 years. I didn't start out in a university. I started out in an independent research institute called the Policy Studies Institute, where I worked on workplace-related matters. I got interested in linked employer-employee data very early on, trying to understand the workplace, what employers do and how workers feel and are paid and what matters to them in the workplace. And that carried on when I moved to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, where I met some of the other WED team. In fact, I'd been at Policy Studies Institute with John Forth and then moved to NISA roughly not long after him. So we've always had these interests shared together. And of course, those surveys are based on survey research, but we've always been interested in administrative data that government holds on workers and firms. And so our interest has always been trying to bring these things together to enrich our understanding of what happens in the workplace and in the labour market. So that's what brought me to this current project, really.
Brilliant. Well, that kind of leads on very nicely to my next question, which was what specifically interested you about the Wage and Employment Dynamics project? What motivated you to get involved, and what do you think the project offers?
Yes, well, across much of Europe and indeed the world, people like me would ordinarily have access to longitudinal linked employer-employee data. And what's wonderful about this, in many cases, Scandinavian countries, others in Central Europe, they'd have 100% of their workers and 100% of the employers in their data sets. And this is tremendous because it basically means you can observe pretty much the world. You can see workers progressing within firms, moving across firms. You can see how employers organize themselves, the boundaries of the firm and so on. And all of these things are key in understanding how the labour market operates, how much time you spend in employment and out of employment, and how you're paid for that sort of work. In Britain, however, we don't currently have access to those data. We have a 1% sample of employees in employment in the annual survey of hours and earnings, and that's the linchpin, the spine, as we call it, to the work that we're doing in the Wage and Employment Dynamics project. What we really want in the long run is what everybody else has got, 100%. In the meantime, we haven't got that, but we are trying to enrich the data that we do have. And we've been doing that in the project by linking this ASH data to other data sets, such as the census. And in doing so, this becomes more and more interesting for both policy people and for academics, because we increase the number of things that we see, the nature of the people in the data, who they are, what their characteristics are, and similarly on the employer side. At the same time, as we do that, as we enrich the data and we bring more people in to use the data and we understand the world in a more complete way, as for example, looking at the role of employers in ethnic wage gaps, which is something we're working on at the moment. So we hope in the medium term, the providers of the data will have relationships with us whereby they trust us more over time. And in doing so, because there are legal gateways available to governments and their agencies to allow us to have access to these larger data sets, ultimately, hopefully one day, the 100%, that's where we want to get to in the end. So this is just the one step along the way, this Wage and Employment Dynamics project, possibly quite a big step, actually, because some things have happened on this project that are truly precedent setting, notably HMRC providing us in a secure setting with data from payroll data, which we can link to the annual survey of hours and earnings. So we hope that in the long run, this will continue and we will get the data that we need, which is going to help us understand the world of work and the labour market in a more complete way.
Could you say a little bit about where you think that hesitancy comes from? Why the UK is hesitant to have that 100%?
Well, I don't know if I'd characterise it as hesitancy as such. The legal framework which makes this permissible is relatively new. And the agencies who would be required to provide these data ultimately have a number of functions and responsibilities and are fairly resource constrained. So whilst they may see the advantages of providing these sorts of data, it takes time and energy to create the infrastructure and to provide the resource to do so. There's also, I think, quite reasonably great concerns around issues like the ethics of providing data that weren't originally for research purposes, but for doing things like paying taxes or providing welfare benefits to researchers. And so it's really, really important that we tackle issues around anonymity and the like, and ensuring that the data are in a secure environment. Much of that infrastructure is really now in place, and so we're starting to benefit from that. But it's just a question of time, I think. We are, I would say, a little bit behind the curve, but I think we're beginning to make some real inroads now, and so it's actually quite an exciting time to be involved in this sort of thing.
Are there any kind of specific insights that either are already coming out of the project or that you think will be coming out in the next kind of phase that you think will be, well, first of all, that you think are interesting, and then secondly, that you think will be kind of influential in convincing policymakers and data owners that this is a worthwhile endeavour?
No question about that. Already under the project, we've identified the absolute importance of understanding key issues in research that impact the quality of the outputs that people produce, specifically non-response, even to statutorily required data from employers, and attrition over time as people are followed over time. People move in and out, they disappear from the data. We have to make assumptions about where they are. But all of this, attrition and non-response, impacts what we can say about things like the incidence of low pay, whether it's getting how many people are affected by low pay, even the proportion of workers who are on the national minimum wage. We've shown through our work that when we account for these things methodologically by reweighting the data, we get a very different picture from the one that policymakers and academics thought was there. So we understand the problem differently, the size of it and the nature of it. So that's really, really important. That's a first order issue that's going to impact the work of the Low Pay Commission and others. It's also going to affect not just understanding the incidence of low pay, but the relation, what happens to low paid workers over time, who moves into higher pay and how they do it. So that's all going to come out in the next part of our work. The other big thing that comes through linking workers to their employers is you start to understand the world, not just by virtue of who you are as an individual worker, age, race, gender, and the like, but also where you work and who you work for. And economists have known for some time that this really matters, but boy, it's becoming much more salient in our understanding of the world. Which employer you actually work for has a profound effect on your wages over time. And it will affect things like how we understand the gaps between earnings across ethnic groups in Britain, for example. Things that we previously put down to differences in individual characteristics of workers actually turns out was only partly true, because a lot of it was actually to do with the employers they were working for. We didn't know that because we didn't have sufficient data linking employers to workers with their ethnicity. Now we have that through the ASH linked to the 2011 census. And of course, we want to go further. We now want to link it to the 2021 census. Some may think we're being greedy, but this is really, really important to ensure that we're doing timely policy relevant research. So we're going to seek funding for that next. So those are just two examples of the ways in which you see the world differently. And this matters in understanding the nature of labour markets, the role of employers, but it also has very direct policy implications.
Yeah. So I was thinking as you were saying that, what difference will having that different perspective make? And do you think that that will have policy implications? What do you think that might look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really, really important to recognize that the role that employers have in the labour market. If you only ever see workers, you can think of the world as largely driven by what economists would call the supply side. Who's offering their labour and under what conditions? And if we don't observe the employers, we forget that actually employers are very heterogeneous. They're very different from one another. Some are better than others. Some are much bigger than others. Some are paying workers in a better way than others. And so one crucial thing is, across the whole of economics, academics have been interested in the idea that there are some firms that tend to pay higher wages, some firms lower wages. Some of this is about the industry that they're located in, not all of it. And so if you get into a high wage firm, that can really benefit you into the long run. If you're stuck in a lower paying firm for some time, this can really damage your long-term labour market prospects. So what we're doing with this sort of research is we're factoring in the role of the employer in terms of things that really matter to people over the long run. What's their real wage growth look like? What's the role of the employers that they enter? What's the difference between a promotion within a firm versus switching firms for a wage hike? Yeah, all of these things can matter quite substantially, and they interact with policy. It could be that by hiking up the national minimum wage, which is what's been going on recently relative to median earnings, perhaps the incentives for moving across firms or getting an additional promotion will diminish because low paid workers see their wages rising anyway. That's one hypothesis, but it might not be true. The only way we can actually test that is with the sorts of data that we're now collecting.
Do you foresee any barriers for kind of this data having a real impact on policy or practice?
Yes, there are always threats and dangers. Resources I've already mentioned. So we are creating an infrastructure, basically a public good, which allows government people and academics, anybody who's accredited to enter this secure space to access the data, to go use it and to see it in a transparent way. It'll be properly codified, recorded, with good supporting documentation. But this needs updating continually over time. You don't want the resources to suddenly stop and then lots of this deplete or degrade over time. It needs to be continually updated and improved, and that involves a long-term commitment of resources and endeavour. I think the will is there, and we know how to go about this. The momentum is building, but it's really important to keep that in the public eye. I'll give you a good example of a problem. A study that John Forth and I were involved in for many years, the Workplace Employment Relations Survey, has been phenomenally successful over years in providing insights into the nature of the workplace in Britain and how workers feel about their jobs and management. It was conducted in 1980, 84, 1990, 1998, 2004, and 2011. Then it stopped. and it stopped because of resources. Currently, we've got some money through ESCO and ONS funded research centre to try and revisit that and encourage all stakeholders to come together and recognise that a somewhat modified version of that old linked employer-employee approach to understanding the workplace needs to be resuscitated, because it provided insights which we currently don't have, goes beyond administrative data by bringing in surveys of workers and employers that give you much more detail about how they're feeling and what they're doing and what they're exposed to in the workplace. We shouldn't be in this position. We shouldn't have had a whole decade since the last survey of this type. If we get this thing funded, it will be a big upgrade and a big update, but we'll link it to the administrative data to which I've been referring. So it'll have much more depth to it. And I hope there'll be enough interest to persist in continuing to fund it, to make it a longitudinal data set that supplements the bedrock of the administrative data. So that's my biggest concern about threats to the future going forward. There will always be the will there on the part of all participants, I think, government and academics. We know how to do these things. The legal gateways are there. What we really need is resources and also an ongoing recognition of the value of this work. And that's really our responsibility, the second one. It's up to us to explain to people why this is important, to exhibit to them what can be done with the data, to bring together the data and make it available to people in an understandable, transparent, secure way. And then we just need the resource to go do that. So that's really the only obstacle I see going forward.
That's brilliant, Alex. I think you've kind of touched on my last question, which was just going to be finally, what are kind of your hopes for the project going forward and what you think is kind of needed next? But I think you've touched on that a little bit.
Well, going forward, we definitely need to work out the next stages. So what, in first place, we need to complete the project to the best of our ability, and that involves linking in a bunch of data that I haven't even mentioned yet, the self-assessment data for the self-employed to the annual survey of hours and earnings. That would be a tremendous undertaking, which we're currently doing. Bringing in migrant scan data so we can understand the world of work from a migrant's perspective. Clearly very, very policy relevant. That's going to be a big deal. So we'll have all these outputs, as it were, these research data set outputs. We've got now stakeholder groups and other communities of users who no doubt will use those data, including young people coming through the pipeline. Really, really important. PhDs and other students, the new generation of people getting used to these data. So we'll create a cohort of people for whom it is their expectation that they'll have access to this sort of thing. It won't be, oh, there's nothing out there in the UK, I'll have to go abroad to ply my trade as an economist or a sociologist. Rather, we'll have it here. They can understand UK, can compare and contrast with other countries. And so we need to build that community, but we also need to build the infrastructure. That's teams of individuals willing and able and funded to carry this work forward into the future, because of course it's a never-ending exercise. I've already mentioned trying to link in the census 2021 to the annual survey of hours and earnings. That will be another tremendous achievement, and I'm really hoping in the long run that we will no longer be reliant on this 1% sample of employees in employment, that instead we will have access to all the PAYE records and self-assessment records, which will essentially allow us to construct all employers in the UK and all workers who work in those workplaces. Notice I've said the UK there. Here, going beyond England, Wales and Scotland, there's a lot of activity in Northern Ireland as well, and they have this interest too. When we've done that, then we really will be in the first division in terms of data analysis for labour economists and for others interested in the operation of the labour market. And then we'll really be able to understand what the world of work looks like in the UK, something that we can only partially observe at the moment.
It's brilliant. Thank you. It's a great kind of vision to end on there. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks, Naomi.
Time. All right.
Just tell me if you need anything redone or whatever you want to do, and then we